Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's political editor, and your host for this week's show. Niall Ferguson writes in this magazine why he thinks Donald Trump is not just going to win the Republican nomination, but also the presidential race. He joins me alongside Freddy. There's another election coming up more imminently. That's in Turkey. Edgy Temelkuran writes that it's the final countdown for this Middle Eastern democracy. She'll be on to explain. In Westminster, the fallout from the local elections goes on as the Tories recover from a very bad night. But Liz Truss is keeping herself busy at least. The former Prime Minister is off to Taiwan. We'll be catching up with the Spectator's political correspondent, James Heale. Svitlana Morenets is on the show to talk about Russia's child snatchers. And finally, Damian Thompson will be joining to review the music of the coronation. He'll be giving us his verdict of what went right and the one thing that went wrong. Once again, thanks to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring this week's episode. Canaccord will provide you with the expertise you need to help you build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information. Now this week, Donald Trump was ordered to pay $5 million in damages to a writer who claims he raped her in a changing room almost 30 years ago. It was a civil case and he was found not guilty of rape, but was ordered to pay for distress. So is his White House bid now over? Perhaps not, says the historian Niall Ferguson. He joins me now alongside Spectator Deputy Editor Freddy to talk about what Donald Trump 2.0 could look like. Niall, how can Trump come back from this?
The way he's come back from so many other things. There are many cases coming up. This is just the early stage of the lawfare that is being waged against Trump. This is an important moment in the minds of liberal commentators because they say, well, he'll never get another woman to vote for him from now until after 2024 is safely over. And this is a misreading of the situation. We don't need to go into the specifics of the case. Just assume that there will be some legal case or other about Donald Trump in the news every month from now until the election, which seems about right because there are at least 17 cases coming up. What does that mean? Well, it means he's highly likely, in fact, to get the nomination for the Republican Party because no other candidate will get any news coverage. And this is part of the Democrat strategy. They want to run against Trump. And these cases are designed simultaneously to make Trump the nominee and to discredit him in the eyes of various voting groups. And I just think this strategy is going to fail. And it's going to fail for one very, very simple reason. There is highly likely to be a recession between now and November of next year. And no president since Calvin Coolidge, nearly 100 years ago, has won a re-election if there's been a recession in the 2 years before that election. That's the problem for the Democrats. They can do all the lawfare they like, but it's the economy, stupid, remember.
Freddie, do you think the Democrats are right to think that Donald Trump is their best hope of the various potential candidates when it comes to a race with Joe Biden leading for them?
No, I'm not sure they are. I mean, the polls, it's too early to say because these polls are very raw still, but the polls suggest that Trump has a better chance against Biden than Ron DeSantis does, who's the sort of putative rival that everyone's talking about. I think the Democrats, as Neil says, a lot of them think they're playing a very, very clever game, and this game could easily blow up in their faces. Quite how sort of high level this clever game goes, quite how deliberate and coordinated it is, I think it's hard to say. I think you can sort of get into the realm of conspiracy theory to think that all of these cases are sort of strategized. But it's certainly true that the Democrats want Trump. They think they can beat Trump. But the polls suggest, early on, as I said, but the polls suggest that maybe they can't.
Neil, do you think there's something in Donald Trump as a scandal-proof politician? With Boris Johnson, that phrase was often used. In the end, scandal did come for him eventually. Is that what we're seeing here in the sense, do you think to the base Donald Trump needs to get out, this could look as though it's a conspiracy against their man?
Well, of course, if bases mattered in British politics, I don't think Boris Johnson would have been ousted because he still has a lot of support at the base, and it was Tory MPs who turned against him. Well, Trump doesn't need to worry about Republican members of Congress who perhaps are squeamish the way Tory MPs are. He just has to get his primary voters out particularly in the early primaries. And I think he has a far better chance of doing that than Ron DeSantis, who, for all his success as governor of Florida, doesn't strike me as the kind of person who does well in New Hampshire or at hog fairs in Iowa. Trump has this extraordinarily committed base of people. And Freddy said something important about conspiracies. Now, we may not believe in a conspiracy to wage multiple lawsuits against Donald Trump for political reasons, but many Republicans certainly do.
And independents.
And independents, exactly, who are, of course, extraordinarily important in this election. Remember, the United States has the non-existent party to which more people actually affiliate than to Republican or Democratic parties, the independents. And they are not, I think, persuaded by what's going on here. It's also better for Trump, I think, than the election was stolen in 2020 as a narrative. Everybody's bored of that except Trump. But the story, they're out to get me, I'm going to fight the law and I'm going to win, that's a more appealing story, particularly for the kind of people that Trump has to mobilize. I mean, I make the point in the piece that there's something kind of Brazilian about America these days and something more American about Brazil. And Lula's return from actual jail to defeat Bolsonaro was one of the big stories of last year. There's no chance that Trump goes to jail between now and November 2024. They can throw all kinds of lawfare at him, but that's not going to happen. My sense is that all of this ultimately helps him with his base, secures the nomination. The key question is, does it fundamentally alienate those people who did not vote for him in 2020, did in 2016? Are they going to stay alienated? Or are they going to come back to Trump? I think there's a big difference between 2020 and 2024. 2020, it was a mess. There'd been a recession. Remember, my theory is you can't get re-elected if you've had a recession. Well, Trump proves it along with all the other cases, along with Jerry Ford, Jimmy Carter, George H.W. Bush. Trump himself lost because there'd been a recession caused by COVID at the beginning of 2020. And by the time you got to the election, the country felt he'd screwed the pandemic up really badly. But then it turned out in 2021 that more people died of COVID under Joe Biden than under Trump. So that case kind of fell away. Most people now realize that the pandemic was mishandled by the bureaucracy more than it was by Trump. And in any case, this is all water under the bridge. The key question in 2024 will be the economy. I'm pretty sure, given that the Fed has hiked rates by more than 500 basis points, that there's almost no way to stop a recession now. It's going to come relatively late in the year because the economy has so much momentum, the labour market's still hot. But that's terrible timing for the Democrats. And the lesson of history is that if you're president and you're clearly to blame, because this inflation that led to the Fed's tightening was all the fault of the Biden administration in 2021, you're going to get blamed. People are going to say, you know what, these guys gave us inflation and now a recession. Donald Trump didn't do that. Donald Trump gave us full employment with no inflation. That's the question.
And in fact, I'd add, Trump hinted at that in his much panned re-election campaign announcement, his 2024 campaign announcement. He said, Americans don't feel the pain yet, but it's coming on the economy. And I think that's always been part of his plan. He's always sensed, and he has quite a good instinct for these things, that there's a big economic pain coming and that will play in his favour. And actually, it's not just trumpets. That's where the sort of talk about bases confuses people. It's not just trumpets. There's a lot of people who sort of don't love Trump, but they don't hate him either, and they might vote for him and they might not. And those people sort of went against him in 2020. They went for him in 2016. They could easily go back towards him in 2024.
Yeah, and I think they're going to be saying to themselves, not only, how's the economy been? They'll be asking that old Ronald Reagan question, you're better off today than you were 4 years ago. They're also going to be looking at Biden's foreign policy and saying, gee, no end in sight to this war in Ukraine. It feels like we've run down all our stocks of weapons. And now the Biden folks seem to want to get into a fight over Taiwan. Well, we didn't have any of that with Trump as president. Now, just to address a really important point that we haven't touched on. If Trump were easy to destroy politically, he would long ago be destroyed. The guy basically was involved in an attempted insurrection. There seems more and more evidence to support that the thesis that he played a pretty bad role on January the 6th. It certainly wasn't a good look. Even if you take the most benign reading, he did something pretty close to inciting that mob. Has that hurt his chances? No. He's further ahead as the front runner than almost any candidate in recent contested primaries. So I have to say, if he can get away with inciting an insurrection, he can get away with having assaulted somebody in the mid-1990s in a civil case. That just doesn't seem like a career-ending moment at all by Donald Trump standards.
On that, Freddy, what about female voters? Do we think that that could be an issue for Trump at the next election? Perhaps the case we're talking about would have an impact there.
I think it has been an issue for him in the past. Suburban mums broke against him in 2020, quite crucially. Again, though, I'd say there's an assumption among Democrats that all women will hate him that just isn't shared by as many or as much of the population as they think it is.
Now, before we just get Freddy to run us through some of the potential candidates who might try and stop Trump, perhaps try and fail, I just... on the point there about Ukraine and ultimately support, Neil, do you think that if there is a Republican, president, and that is Donald Trump, we could see actually a big change of policy in terms of America's engagement in Ukraine?
Well, this is the main reason I'm talking about this. People seem to be attaching too low a probability to this scenario. To say that Trump feels less enthused by Volodymyr Zelensky than Joe Biden would be the understatement of the week. He has no interest, I think, whatsoever in supporting this war. I think his lack of commitment to NATO was one of the things that was obvious in his first term. But there were generals in the administration then whose job it was to restrain Trump and keep him reading the talking points on the benefits of the Western alliance. Those generals will not be involved in Trump 2.0. So I think it's not just that the commitment to Ukraine will weaken. I think it's also that NATO itself will find its future in question, because Trump's old and repeated question about burden sharing can be asked yet again in the context of the war in Ukraine, where the US is overwhelmingly the biggest supporter of Ukraine, despite the fact that this is a war in Eastern Europe. I'd also mention China. I mean, one of the things that's really extraordinary about the history of the recent past is that it was Trump who kind of woke Americans up to the China threat. But in Trump's mind, it was really just an economic threat to which you should respond with tariffs. He wanted a trade war. It morphed into a Cold War rather against his instincts. And that Cold War has been continued and intensified by the Biden administration. Particularly the issue of Taiwan. Biden's talked about that far more than Trump did. Trump, in John Bolton's memoir, likened Taiwan to a Sharpie, a small marker pen, relative to his desk, China. And I think it's obvious from that particular exchange that Trump does not think Taiwan is something worth fighting for, certainly not worth risking American lives for. And this is part of what I think Americans will remember, that there were no new wars on Donald Trump's watch. It's not as important as the economy, but I don't think it's trivial. I don't think enthusiasm for Ukraine will be sustained. It was the current thing in 2022. It replaced Black Lives Matter in yards all over Northern California. But ultimately, the big lesson of history is that American commitment to foreign engagements, even if it's an indirect commitment in which the Americans themselves aren't fighting, that it fades. It fades because the news cycle moves on.
But perhaps that's an area where Biden hasn't actually blundered quite as much as he could have done. I mean, he's been a sort of publicly a reluctant supporter of Ukraine in some ways. I mean, vocally, yes, but he's always been sort of backed into the tanks, the jets. He hasn't been, it's not an intervention in a sort of Iraq or Afghanistan.
But with every passing month, the commitment gets larger and more expensive. And it was Biden who went to Kyiv and appeared side by side with Zelensky, stressing that the United States would do, quote, whatever it takes. Now, that's all very well and good right now. But when the recession comes, as I think it likely will, Americans are going to start asking the question, why are we spending all this money on a war in Eastern Europe that really is the responsibility of the Europeans? I don't think that that issue is particularly good for Biden, and it might get steadily worse for him as the war drags on.
You talked briefly there about Biden and the economy and Trump and the economy in relation to foreign policy and so on. A big thing, of course, is the Inflation Reduction Act. And although that's very unpopular in Europe with European leaders and people, I think moves like that actually have helped Biden. Perhaps in the midterms they helped. economic protectionism is popular in America.
Yes, but
Biden, whether he knows it or not, has latched onto that and has continued.
Who revived protectionism? Donald Trump.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing about the Biden administration is that it actually is more protectionist, because the Inflation Reduction Act is actually more protectionist in practice than Trump's tariffs were. But all this represents is the stealing of clothes. I mean, what the Biden folk realized was, we better remain hawkish on China because that worked for Trump. We can't take the tariffs off because those work for Trump. And all of this just pays him the ultimate compliment. Imitation's a sincere form of flattery. And if I'm an American who thinks that industrial policy works, which it doesn't, but if I think that it works, well, why not just get the original? Why get the knockoff Biden version when you can have the original Trump?
And partly for the reasons you just set out, Neil, I wondered, Freddy, that if we were to get Trump 2.0, this would be an emboldened Trump, one even less likely to listen to experts, advisors in the White House when it comes to, yes, foreign policy, but also a range of issues, because they would come in thinking, I know exactly what I want to do.
I think it would be emboldened in a lot of ways, particularly on this sort of war on the deep state, as he dubs it, because I think there's a feeling in Trump world that his big mistake, and I think Trump even sort of slightly acknowledged it, that his big mistake was he tried to work with Washington. He didn't fully go to war with Washington and destroy all the institutions of American government as he should have done. So I think he'd be emboldened to do that. Again, he would find that it's harder to do in practice than in rhetoric. But I think the way he's talking about the deep state now, I mean, it's very, very incendiary. He said recently, I will be your retribution. This is almost sort of biblical talk. And I think that's going to be, if he wins with that kind of angry message, then I think you're going to see a much bolder Trump in 2024 if he wins.
Yeah, no more Mr. Nice Guy doesn't seem like an appropriate phrase in the case of Donald
Trump. But he did try to be nice.
But I definitely agree with you. I mean, and if you talk to people who were in the Trump administration, that the conversation is essentially, we won't be caught out next time around. We've learnt the pitfalls. So I think it will be very different, and there won't be the same restraining influences, nor the concessions to establishment and bureaucratic interests that characterized particularly the first couple of years. And this should make the Democrats really afraid, because what Trump was able to do in his first term, the Supreme Court, could be done on a much larger scale across all the different agencies if they approach it with sufficient ruthlessness. And I think that's exactly what they do.
Yeah.
And do you think it'd be good for the economy?
Yes.
You mentioned, yeah.
Yeah, and this is the great thing to remember. The day that it's clear, on the night that it's clear that Trump's been re-elected, heads will be exploding on the Harvard campus, the Stanford campus, the Yale campus, the New York Times offices, CNN will be in meltdown. Everybody will be on air in tears predicting the end of the Republic.
It'll be great fun.
Mussolini's
We'll go back to one of the network
Hitler,
parties.
Is he Hitler or is he Mussolini? All of that stuff will be going on, and the market will be rallying, because investors will know that this will represent an improvement, just as it was an improvement when Trump got elected. I mean, the Trump administration got no plaudits for this because the media refused to acknowledge it. But in fact, the deregulation and the tax cuts delivered significant improvements. The labor market was in great shape. For the first time since 1999, real household disposable income went up. It had flatlined since the Clinton years. And Trump delivered a 9% increase in real disposable household income. Now, people have got short memories in America, but they're not that short. And people aren't so suffering from amnesia that they've forgotten how well things were going until the pandemic struck.
Now, we're nearing the end of this segment. Briefly, Freddy, we mentioned Ron DeSantis. Is there anyone else who potentially could stop at least the first stage of Trump 2.0 by getting that Republican nomination?
I don't think so. I think Nikki Haley's not going to go anywhere, and that would be the only other candidate that might. Pence is not going to happen. DeSantis was the only person that might have stopped Donald Trump. There was a sort of interesting moment after the midterms where a lot of the right-wing media got behind DeSantis, and there was a bit of excitement there. But the lawfare works for Trump in the sense that he's sucking all of the oxygen out of the conversation in Republican politics. DeSantis is fading in the polls. He's been wrong-footed a little bit on things like Ukraine. And Trump is canny. On New Hampshire, Trump's talking a lot about social security. New Hampshire's an early primary state. He knows that DeSantis is not trusted on social security, and New Hampshire voters care a lot about that. So he picks his issues very carefully, and he's a brilliantly effective campaigner. Whatever you think of Donald Trump, you have to acknowledge he is very, very good at crunching things down to very sort of key points and hammering them very hard. DeSantis has had successful election campaigns. He's been an effective governor in many ways. But is he as good as Trump at the sort of really nasty presidential campaign politics? So far, the evidence is no.
And is your base case, Freddy, the same in the sense that you think it is your base case for the US election a Donald Trump victory?
I'm going to differ with Neil now. I think he'll probably be right in the end. But for now, I'm going to say I think, as things stand, Biden just edges Trump, but I think it'll be much closer than people think.
And Neil, just finally, you can tell me if I'm being too nosy, but you are now an American citizen. Could you ever be tempted to vote for Donald Trump?
I didn't vote for him in 2020. I just felt that things had been disgracefully mismanaged. But I have to say that if you ask me to make a choice between Joe Biden, who'll be 82, and Donald Trump in 2024, I'll find it quite hard not to vote for Trump. And that's going to get me cancelled back at Stanford right now.
You'll go for the spring chicken that is Donald Trump.
Well, I mean, let's face it, you're as young as you sound.
Yes.
And there's no doubt who sounds a lot younger, and it's not Joe Biden.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Freddy. Erdogan is facing the challenge of his political career this Sunday as Turkey goes to the polls. Edgy Temelkuran in this week's magazine says that it's the final countdown for democracy in the country. She joins me now along with Hannah Lucinda Smith. Edgy, in this week's magazine you write about the upcoming elections in Turkey, and you're explaining to a Western audience how we should understand the political scene, and you use an example involving Brexit and Trump. Can you talk us through this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, like all those people who come from complicated non-Western countries, we have to simplify things for the Western audience to have an access to our madness, so to speak. So yeah, I'm using that. You know, imagine 20 years of Brexit pending, or imagine a Trump with political genius and Islamic aspirations. Recently, we had to do it for the earthquake as well, to explain the scale of the impact. We were saying that it's one Austria or two Swedens and so on. So this is what we do. I mean, like, we're trying to break down our extremely complex insanity for the Western audiences. And this was the only way to explain how Turkish people feel after 20 years of Erdogan, I think.
Hannah, could you give us a summary of the election campaign so far?
Yeah, so I mean, it got off to quite a slow start. At the beginning, when campaigning started in late March, the government said, out of respect for the earthquake victims, we're going to keep it low key. There's going to be no music. There's not really going to be, what you usually have in a Turkish election campaign, which is, election vans driving around, and every public square you have the parties setting out their stalls and playing music. Yeah, they said at the start this time around it's going to be very low key, and it was until the end of Ramadan, the end of April, and then since then it's really got into gear. And I think particularly since Erdogan and his team have realised that they are in danger of losing, that there's a possibility that they could lose this one. Kılıçdaroğlu has never looked like a particularly hopeful candidate in the past, and I think when he was announced as the presidential candidate back in March, probably the government and Erdogan, kind of thought, oh, brilliant, well, we'll definitely beat him. And against all odds, Kılıçdaroğlu has actually managed to kind of hold a really diverse and quite fragile coalition together. And I think, particularly in the past week, we've seen not only the campaigning increase, both Kılıçdaroğlu and Erdogan held massive rallies in Istanbul at the weekend. They've been both touring the country all over the place, but also we've seen a kind of escalation of the rhetoric. We've seen Erdogan, increasing this kind of really divisive, really caustic rhetoric. And, at the same time as promising all kinds of things and talking about all the things that he's done in 20 years in power, we've seen him going for LGBT communities. We've seen him going for Kılıçdaroğlu over his Alevism, over his faith. We've seen a classic Erdogan tactic, him talking about people who give votes to the opposition as terrorists. So he's really turning to all these kind of fault lines that he's exploited in the past and have worked for him in the past. Now the question is, are they going to work for him this time? That's the key question.
Yeah. That's true. I mean, yeah, we are. Well, I am wishing that it won't, but then I can see that it is working for his fanatics, as we spoke earlier before the program, Hannah. I mean, like, it is incredible, and it is not easy to explain, especially to Western audience, why there are still people who are supporting Erdogan like there is no tomorrow. And we all know that, like, they cannot be convinced otherwise, even if you come with the most concrete, if evidence that proves that he's a fraud.
And actually, on that, I mean, you write in your piece about the final countdown for Turkey. Can you talk us through what is at stake here, really, for the country? I mean, were Erdogan to win again, what does that mean?
Well, to begin with, I mean, like, this is a 2 decades long rule, Erdogan. And the first term was a little bit milder, less eventful, let's say. But then after this, he won the power for the second time. He kind of unleashed his aspiration for power, holding on to power forever. And especially after 2013 Gezi uprising, it became clear that there will be suppression, and those who do not obey Erdogan's regime will be labeled as terrorists, which has been the case since last 10 years now. And then after 2016, the coup attempt, everything got really blurry. The coup attempt has been used as an excuse by Erdogan to suppress the entire country, all his critics. And there are thousands of people in prison. Tens of thousands have left Turkey right after the coup because it became clear that they will not be able to live as first-class citizens. And now there's the economic crisis. So Erdogan is very clear through his propaganda machine, through his own statements, that he's going to be ruling the country as a political asylum, so to speak. Recently, like I think it was yesterday, his interior minister, now MP candidate, Süleyman Soylu, a very important political figure in this, campaign, said that they have been stomping on us, referring to the opposition. And he said, we are going to be stomping all over them after the election, which is an open threat. And if you live in Turkey, you know that this means violence. This means all out, oppression. So, Western audiences do not like me using this word, but it is fascism. And it will be fully formed fascism if Erdogan wins this election.
Hannah, do you think that's fair?
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, clearly Erdogan is, he's an Islamist, of course, but I think that there is far too much focus on that part of what he is. If we really examine what's going on here, it's fascism. I mean, look at the kind of, the definition, everything in service of the state. The leader becomes inseparable from the state and inseparable from the nation. So, and then, that system wants to control everything. It wants to control art. It wants to control music, culture, discussion, media, business, everything. Okay, this is a definition of fascism, and this is what's happened in Turkey. And I think, we really can't overstate, if Erdogan wins again and wins another 5 years, there is going to be nothing left of democracy in this country. If we look at what he's done since 2018, after the last elections. So in 2018, those elections triggered a new constitution in which Erdogan is executive president, in which basically the state is almost kind of arranged around him like the Sun King. Everything comes from him. The ministries no longer really have any autonomy. State institutions don't. The courts are full of his loyalists. The electoral board is full of his loyalists. The security forces have been purged. We don't know really what's going on in the security forces and how loyal they are to him. Give him another 5 years, there is going to be nothing left of the democratic checks and balances in this country. Even now, really the only kind of balance that is left is elections. It's his only Achilles heel, is the fact that he still has to go to the ballot box, because that's the way he came in. And that's the rhetoric he relies on. When you listen to Erdogan talk, it's all about the will of the people, about democratization, etc. So he still relies on the ballot box, but pretty much there's almost nothing else left in terms of democratic checks and balances.
And those elections are frequently overshadowed, shadowed by the election fraud, massive election fraud and vote theft, which has become so natural that the opposition party is giving, seminars and briefings about how they're going to protect the votes from the vote theft of the government. This is like insanity. On one side, there is a man and his propaganda machine going towards a war, as if, and the opposition is still trying to use the democratic means. I think this is the importance of this election goes far beyond Turkey, because all those countries who have been subjected to rising authoritarianism have to learn. If Kılıçdaroğlu, if the opposition wins, Turkey will be showing the entire world that you can get rid of an authoritarian fascist leader through democratic means, despite the fact that he ruined every institution in the country. And not only the institutions, to be honest, it's the moral demise of a country. Hannah would be very familiar with this. There are videos of AKP supporters that are quite popular on social media, and they're showing Erdogan devotees, rather, saying we are going to vote for Erdogan because he gave us the chance to beat up the doctors if we do not like them. And they see this as their I don't know. They see this their rightful response to an oppressive elite, which is now which Western world is not quite familiar with that term. So it's not only going to be fascism, but also it's going to be this. I cannot not use strong words. It's going to be vandalism prevailing over basic moral values of a country.
And just on the fallout from the result, I wondered, do you think that whatever the result is, it will be accepted?
What do you think, Anna?
Listen, Erdogan has form. I mean, in 2019, in the local elections in Istanbul, the opposition won by a super fine margin. It was the first time in 25 years that Erdogan's party had not won in Istanbul. Istanbul is his home city. It's his power base. It was and he turned it into a referendum on himself as well. So it was like a personal insult to him. And he leaned on the electoral board to overrule it. Now, in the end, what happened, İmamoğlu, the opposition candidate, he's got a really, really smart team around him. They really went for it in terms of, hitting the streets and doing whatever they could. And he won again. But, I think, whether you see this as like a hopeful sign or, a kind of warning depends on whether you're an optimistic person or not. Some people say, well, look, in the end, democracy won. Personally, for me, I think, this shows that he's totally willing to use the institutions to overrule results he doesn't like. And I think, this is national elections. This isn't just Istanbul. We're 4 years on from that. He's gathered even more powers. Back in 2019, the Constitutional Court was still somewhat independent. Like now, not at all. And I think, it comes down to a numbers game. I think if the opposition can win it by a really clear margin, and I'm talking sort of 10%, then it would be very, very difficult, I think, for Erdogan to lean on the bureaucracy and on the state apparatus as he did in 2019. On the other hand, if it's 2%, 3%, which is what it's looking like at the moment, I'm sure he's going to do that. I have no doubt. And
just finally, Ettin, perhaps you could explain to viewers on this, if Erdogan loses, what can the country and those looking on expect from the opposition? It's a coalition of different parties, is that right?
Okay, I cannot be cool-headed about this. I have many friends who are going to wear belly dancer costumes and dance in central Istanbul, men and women. So it will be a big holiday, a national holiday for sure, at least for half of the country. But they have been waiting for this quite a long time. So it will be such a relief. We have an expression in Turkish, as if the ox that's sitting on my chest has just got up. I think the feeling will be like that. Finally we're going to breathe. In terms of real politics, I think what a Brazilian social media user said when Bolsonaro lost goes for Turkey as well. We know that it's not going to be heaven, but at least we will know that the doors of the hell will be closed. And that's such a relief. That will be such a relief, hopefully.
I'm joined now by James Heale, political correspondent at The Spectator, to catch up on the week in British politics. So James, we've had the local election results coming in on Friday. We had the King's coronation, which I think distracted. I think you had to get to page 64 or 66 of the Mail on Sunday to get to the politics content. But politics is now back. What is the fallout you've been picking up?
Well, I think so far, I think it's not a question about Rishi Sunak's leadership, but I do think there is a lot of discontent, and I think that's been partly directed at CCHQ. There was a meeting of 1922 yesterday with Greg Hands, the party chairman, and so I think there is a sense perhaps it's maybe about sort of policy tweaks and to do with personnel in the party machine rather than kind of any direct challenge to the Prime Minister.
Yes, we're in that area where there's lots of theories about what went wrong for the Conservatives, given they lost over 1,000 council seats. But these theories can often be quite contradictory. So there are some Tory MPs saying we must build more houses. There's some saying we built too many houses. Are you picking up any coherent complaints?
I would say that a lot of it is in conflict, I think, with each other. And I think the politics is it's all very bad. There's no easy, really, options for the Conservatives. They were attacked in the north, they were attacked in the south, in Brexit areas. I mean, one of my favourite stats from the night was that Labour did the best among areas with the least graduates, but the Tories did worse among graduates. So basically they're getting pummeled by every sort of demographic, really. And I think the Tory party is just really kind of sticking with the plan they have. And I think that was most noticeable on the weekend after the results. You had people like Lucy Fraser doing the media round, you had Rishi Sunak coming out, giving interviews. And really they're just going to stick on with 5 priorities. And I think the hope within number 10 and CCHQ is that by doing so, they're going to be shown as delivering for the British people rather than Labour and Lib Dems shouting from the sidelines.
Yeah, and I mean, what Downing Street are trying to effectively say, and government ministers, is that it was always going to be a difficult night. Much of this was due to the year before, which is why I think you're having fewer people say this is about Rishi Sunak's leadership, though you do get grumbles and people saying, well, does he need to do more? Does he need to show more of himself? Does he need a big idea? But one of the things I write about in the politics column this week is that squeeze, which is, I think, there was an expectation in advance Labour would have a pretty good night. I think you can see some results that they had a decent night. Now the largest party of local government, partly down to Tory failure. But, some key wins in those areas, you'd be looking at a general election to turn red to suggest the party's going into government. But what seemed to take lots of Tory MPs by surprise was actually the success by the Liberal Democrats and some of the smaller parties. Can you talk us through that?
Yes, of course. And I think you start off your column this week with a fantastic revelation that Rishi Sunak is a Bombbuster fan, loves a good Jilly Cooper. And in Jilly Cooper's books, talks about sort of a depiction of sort of Tory rural England, and now you make the point that those areas wouldn't be voting Conservative anymore. I think that's the key point, really. It's not even so much necessarily pro-Labour, it was an anti-Tory strategy of the night. Tories lost more than 1,000 seats, and basically anywhere that the Greens stood in a sort of concentrated area, they could win seats there off the Tories. There was the Liberals, obviously did very well. I think beforehand they were expected to win about 150 or so seats as a good night, and they won more than 400, the Liberal Democrats. And they were also taking it in quite sort of high-profile seats as well, places like Surrey Heath, Michael Gove's constituency. They took control of Windsor and Maidenhead. They also took the Eton ward, which you wrote about as well. So I think it's about, the brand of the Tories, which is really very damaged. And I think you've got to remember, of course, that this was the first election result since the end of Boris Johnson, the beginning and end of Liz Truss. And, so this is a verdict on those as well. And that's a point that the government can't really stress in public, I would say, but privately they're making, because they're worried about reigniting sort of Tory tensions if Rishi Sunak frankly came out and said, well, guys, there was the whole mini budget and they're delivering a sort of belated kicking for that. I think the hope in government is that they can kind of take back some of the, they recognise them sort of about the anger and then move on and then try and sort of maybe play on the tensions between the Lib Dems and the Labour in terms of coalition.
Now, the Liberal Democrats have had a few moments before, but sometimes they can be false dawns.
Yes.
If we think about 2019, when the Lib Dems did fantastically well in the European elections, and then it came to that general election, which the Liberal Democrats helped usher in. They thought it was a good idea, and it was overall, I think they lost one seat as a net total. But of the seats they lost, one was Joe Swinson, the leaders. So it is always trickier for them to replicate what happens at a local elections, at a general election. That can be a regular problem for smaller parties, but often Labour can do better from local to general. What do you think we could be looking at in terms of where the Liberal Democrats, how much of this Lib Dem comeback, how big is it going to be?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be, seismic necessarily, but they're starting from quite a low base. So you'd expect them to make, sort of double-digit gains, I'd say, in the next election. Obvious places include sort of Cheltenham, the seat of the new Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, where he's got a majority of less than 1,000. I think that's almost certain to go Liberal Democrat next time. Other places include Esher, Malton, which is Dominic Raab's seat. So it's the kind of places where I think, there's a sort of, they were traditionally seen as sort of Remainy Tories, basically, sort of wealthy, prosperous in the south of England. So they can expect to make gains of, I'd say, around, sort of at this stage, it looks like sort of 20 or so.
Now, two other things happening this week. Let's first start with the row over EU retained law. Now, this is ultimately a troubled bill, I think we could say, in the sense successive ministers with that brief have delayed or, dealt with some of the issues about this plan to repeal all the EU laws with this sunset clause. Kemi Badenoch, the new business secretary, has made an announcement, a written ministerial statement, though she has had to speak since, I believe. So she has ultimately said that this isn't going to happen in the way that many Brexiteers had hoped. Can you talk us through it?
Yes, of course. I think it was an issue that sort of dominated the Boris Johnson years, was what kind of Brexit wins, tangible gains we're going to see. And then in the last year's summer leadership race, we saw Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak try to campaign on the issue and making the most out of Brexit, those wins. Famously, Rishi Sunak released a video of him shredding EU law in a shredder. But actually, if you look at the wording of that announcement and the press release around it, it was actually they were going to review a lot of these laws rather than rip them all up in one sort of big bill. So I think this has been actually the government kindly trying to walk back and actually try and be realistic about the number of regulations they can change. Obviously, a lot of Brexiteers aren't particularly happy
because
about
they are
that.
repealing some.
Yes, I think it's about 400 or so, but more than the 4,000 that were part of rolled over from when we left the EU. And so this has obviously caused a lot of tensions. I mean, I think people already on the right of the party are a little bit irritated by what Rishi Sunak's doing on certain areas like tax, and that kind of, it sort of spills over into other areas on Brexit as well. And I do think it's interesting that Kemi Badenoch is doing this at a time when she's seen by many as a kind of future contender for the leadership of the party. This next year or so will be really interesting in whether she can kind of deliver enough meat to her kind of her base of Brexiteers, I would say, and be seen as a competent and effective minister. She's talking today in the Telegraph about the Whitehall blob, etc., the Whitehall machine. The challenge for her is whether she can kind of get to grips with that and deliver on it.
I think it's an interesting question, which is how many Brexiteers in Parliament, at least, are really exercised on EU retained law? Because you have a chief whip meeting last night with around 20 MPs. The whips at the moment don't seem to think when this legislation returns. I think, the jury is still out, but it might not be this huge rebellion. No. And instead, you could have a situation a little bit similar to the Windsor Framework, where there's lots of, briefings, multiple press conferences from the remaining members of the European Research Group. But then it isn't quite the crunch moment perhaps it would have been, you think about Brexit tensions in the 2017 to 2019 period. Yes,
I quite agree. And I do think there's a danger of perhaps conflating actual numbers in Parliament with the kind of Brexit sympathetic media landscape as a whole. I do think one thing you can definitely say about this Rishi Sunak number 10 operation is it's much better at parliamentary management. So I think they're doing a lot more time kind of soothing the tensions and basically just hoping to try and keep the peace, which is probably their best bet going into next year's election, as otherwise voters hate divided parties. So I think that a lot of these rows will be conducted in private rather than perhaps then on the floor of the House of Commons as they did under Liz Truss.
And on the subject of Liz Truss, finally, she's going on a trip
Yeah.
Tell us more, James.
Well, she's going to Taiwan and going to be speaking there next week. And this is something she would say she feels strongly about, but it's obviously caused a bit of tensions within her own party. Alicia Kearns this morning has criticised her for supposed Instagram diplomacy by going to Taiwan. And actually
Alicia Kearns did also go to Taiwan, didn't she?
Yes, I believe so, and yes. So in terms of, there's a split there in the Tory Sino-skeptic ranks, I'd say. And as I say, the point is that under Boris Johnson, there were regular rebellions on China on things like the Genocide Amendment, on things like Huawei, China-related issues. The skeptics had a difficult year or so, I'd say, partly because of the association with what happened with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak coming in to replace her. But I also think is that because the parliamentary management is a lot better, it means that on rebellions, it's difficult to build up a head of steam and unite around an issue. And I think the kind of tensions between Alicia Kearns and Liz Truss we've seen play out is perhaps indicative of that.
Yeah, and it does feel as though the China rebels actually is saying, look at things like the procurement bill, which are coming back to the House. And that's where actually they think there's a way to tangibly affect the government's China policy, as opposed to what Samuel Kearns has called Instagram diplomacy.
Yes.
We shall see. Anyway, thank you, James, for joining Spectator TV today. Svitlana Morenets writes in this magazine about Russia's child snatchers. She joins me now. Svitlana, in this week's magazine, you write about Ukraine's stolen children. Do we know how many children are roughly missing since the invasion began?
Right now, we know about 20,000 of Ukrainian kids being deported to Russia, and this number was confirmed by Ukrainian National Police because the parents and relatives of those kids were going to police and saying, "Hi, my kid is missing," and the kid is in Russia. But the US Department and Ukraine's allies say that this number is much higher. We can talk about 200,000 kids being deported to Russia.
And how does it happen? Ultimately, what is the process for a child being taken? Are there common methods?
Yes, there are various ways, but the most common is when parents who live in occupied territories are told that the kid must go to the Russian camp to have a vacation, some rest from the hostilities. And if parents say no, they are threatened to be deprived of their parental rights, so they don't have a choice. And usually Russian forces promise to take a kid for 1-2 weeks and then bring it back. But they end up staying in Russia or occupied territories for months till they're rescued. But in most of the cases, they just stay there. And also there is a process called filtration when families try to leave the occupied territories and Russian forces decide who can leave and who not. So sometimes in that moment they separate the mother and the kid.
And how are some parents going about trying to be reunited with their lost children?
This is a very complicated thing to do because first they need the foreign passport to travel abroad, and the charity Save Ukraine helps them to do that and to go. They put them in the bus and send them to Russia. But the problem is that mostly parents don't know where their kids are because Russians are hiding their location, or if their location leaks, they just move them from one camp to another, to the orphanages or to the foster families. So only those kids who are older, they have a phone or they know the number, they can ask someone to call their parents and they say, "Hi mom, I'm here, could you please pick me up?" And only in that case it is possible that parents can go and take them. But there is also a problem that Russia allows to do that within 6 months since the child was abducted. So after 6 months, they start the process of adoption. So the time is very limited.
Now, we're about to see an interview you conducted. Can you just talk us through what we're about to watch?
Yes, I spoke to the 16-year-old boy and his mother. He was taken from Kherson region to the Russian camp in occupied Crimea. And instead of 2 weeks, he spent there 6 months till he was rescued. And he talked about all the things that he witnessed there.
Thank you, Svitlana. We'll watch that now.
Нас собрали и сказали, что школа отменяется. Вы видите, какая идет военная обстановка. Дети должны отдохнуть от этих обстрелов. Администрация Российской Федерации подписала заявление о том, что дети все обязаны ехать в лагерь отдыхать. Те мамы, которые не отправят своих детей, тех мам могут лишить родительских прав, потому что мы не выполняем свои родительские обязательства. Один ребенок из семьи, хотя бы один ребенок, должен по-любому поехать отдохнуть. Так как нас заверили, что вы видите, что такая ситуация, пускай дети едут отдыхать на 2 недели. Выезд в 5 утра, подойдите к школе с документами, оригиналами, чтобы у вас все было на руках. Мы подходим в 5 утра. Она нам не дала даже времени, это директор школы, подумать. Сказала, садитесь в автобус, документы уже подготовлены, пакет документов есть, заявление есть, бумаги есть. Все, ваши дети едут отдыхать, не переживайте, все будет хорошо. Через 2 недели они вернутся. Таким путем дети и уехали.
Що відбувалося в таборі, як до вас ставилися, що ти можеш розповісти?
Нас перевезли в дружбу, нас там почали обзивати, казати, що від нас родителі відказали, що ми нікому не треба, що ми там і укропи, і хахли, коротше, матами нас обзивали, і в ізоляторах закривали, і в підвалах. Нас просто там ніхто ненавидів.
А можеш розказати детальніше про ці покарання?
В ізолятор мене закрили на 4 дня за те, що ми слухали гімн України. Ми ходили по лагерю, слухали, хтось доложив Астахову. І він нас каже, йдемо до тебе поговоримо, завів нас в ізолятор і каже, все, забрав телефон у нас, поудаляв все, що треба. І просто каже, сидіть, типа, відповідайте за свої поступки. Ми сиділи там 4 дня, а потім через 4 дня нас випустив, каже, йдіть, поки, типа, добре. В підвал він нас закрив за те, що ми, типа, пішли в магазин. Ми там просиділи в підвалі 4 часа. Нам даже не покормили нас, потом на разговор важном нас собрали, типа, всех детей. И, типа, мене і мою подругу виводять, типа, на сцену. І, типа, говорять, усе, типа, вони за Україну, і починають нас обзивати з Луганська діти, типа, кажуть, що ми больні там, що нас, типа, і прибити треба, що нас і зарізати треба. Просто вважати стоять і ржуть з нас.
А ви, коли були в ізоляторі, вам давали їжу, і у вас був доступ до туалету?
Ну, в ізоляторі там було 2 кроваті, туалет, і нам приносили тільки під вечір кашу.
Скажи, будь ласка, Віталій, а ти ще помічав жорстоке поводження з іншими дітьми?
Да, мою подругу Олю ударили, типа, железною палкою по спині за те, що вона говорила слово Україні. Потім до одної 13-літньої дівчинки, типа, прислала вважати, казала, що у них якісь там відношення. І, типа, сказав, якщо вона щось розказувати буде комусь, що він там її заріже, і там вивезе кудись. І потім її так забрав, типа, папа з лагеря.
Чи він змушував її до чогось?
Ну, типа, інтимні відношення, як вона розказувала, типа, він щось собі там накрутив, що вони там і зустрічаються, що то ще. А вона була просто проти цього, і він, типа, каже, ти мені должна, типа, якщо щось будеш розказувати, я тебе там і приб'ю, і заріжу.
Там якого віку були діти, і чи могли молодші зв'язатися зі своїми батьками?
Ну, там діти було від 5 років до 18, і у них більшу частину не було телефону, вони не могли позвонити. І вони там плакали, говорять, наберіть, позвоніть моїм родителям, ми ж не знаємо їхніх номерів. Ми кажемо, ми не знаємо, а їм казали, що від них і родителі відказали, що просто вони будуть жити в Росії, що їх в дитдом здадуть, а вони сиділи, це ревіли.
Як в загальному була атмосфера? Чи в безпеці там діти почувалися?
Ну, от, смотря там, просто, якщо ми не будемо улыбатися, вони сказали, улыбніться, типа, для фотки. Якщо ми там не будемо улыбатися, вони сказали, нам треба, типа, виложити в Кримський канал. Типа, якщо хтось там щось не буде, типа, лицо скривлене, як вони сказали, будуть, типа, наказані, там, просто сказали, ну, там ми ще співали, типа, пісню якусь смішну, а після цього у нас, типа, гімн Росії кожен раз був, типа, на баяні. Було дуже багато дітей. Я не вірю, що всіх прям дітей родителі забрали, там, либо їх волонтери забрали, не знаю, ну, там в кожному лагері по 1000 чоловік було.
А скільки було таборів, ти не знаєш, але там багато було в Криму, так?
Ну, я знаю, це 6 лагерей, це там, як його, Гагарін, Мечта, Дружба, Таврія, Здравниця, Училище, там дуже багато лагерей.
Була якась навчальна програма, російська, наприклад, чи мали ви співати російський гімн, що ви мали там робити?
Ну да, нас заставляли співати гімн Росії, нам скидували текст Росії, оцього, ну, типа, «Вперед, Росія», там, гімн Росії. Сказали, нам, типа, должны ми вивчити, і завтра утром кожен, типа, розказувати. Хто не розкаже, там буде наказан, там в душ не буде ходити, либо в ізолятор закривають, що-то ще.
And finally, Damian Thompson reviews the music of the coronation. He says there was much to be happy about, and one problem. He joins me now. Damian, you write in this week's magazine about the music at King Charles' coronation. You say it was a triumph. How?
Oh, it was the English choral tradition at its best. Only the English have got a world-class choral tradition anywhere in the world, for complicated historical reasons, but you had several fabulous choirs and a wonderful orchestra, world-class conductors, and some magnificent music. I'm not convinced by all of the new commissions, but you cannot beat I Was Glad and Zadok the Priest, both of which were actually written for English coronations.
You say that what makes the perfect coronation song is knowing how to raise the temperature by subverting expectations. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was pleased with that pretentious little observation, but it's true. Why does your spine tingle with I Was Glad? Even if you don't know anything about harmony, and I don't know that much, but you take in subconsciously that the glad chord, massive chord, is not the one you're expecting. It's not the one that the composer has led you to expect, because he begins in B flat, and then suddenly there's this G major chord, which is quite a remote chord. Glad, I was glad, and it's just not the chord you're expecting, and it's thrilling. Handel does something similar in Zadok the Priest. In other words, he subverts your expectations. So there's all this da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da, but it's the chords he moves through aren't the ones you're expecting. So he goes into the minor, and he goes on a little sort of journey into different keys, and then works his way back to the tonic. And it's the journey back to the tonic that's building expectations, and then he hits the tonic with Zadok, and it's just an explosion of sound. And it doesn't matter that you know it's coming, because after all, you will once, it's not a surprise after you've heard it once, but you know that the thrill is coming, which amounts to the same sort of thing.
Now, it wasn't as long a ceremony as the Queen's, but it was still lengthy. So, Damian, I wondered, how do they go about getting the balance right? And do you think they struck that? Were there any moments where it lacked or sagged a bit for you?
I think there was one misfire, and that was Debbie Wiseman, was she called, wrote 2 Alleluias. She's a film composer. And they're both pretty good. The first one was really lovely, but the second one was sung by a gospel choir. Problem was, it wasn't gospel music. Not remotely. It was in quite sort of shapely Anglican harmonies, and it was joyful. It was a joyful Alleluia, but it did not match the movements of the choir. It just wasn't gospel music. And they were, singing and moving as if it was gospel music, and it wasn't. So I thought that was a bit embarrassing, but just a very, very minor thing. The Lloyd Webber, not the most memorable piece I've ever heard, but then that's not Lloyd Webber for you. He's not an earworm composer. I mean, he's great at creating a theatrical atmosphere. He's a very good technical composer. His father was a composer of Anglican church music, but the King apparently wanted something people would go out humming. And Joanna Lumley said diplomatically on Sky TV, oh, well, perhaps they'll need to hear it again. I'm not sure they'll get the chance. But of course, the thing people went out humming, I suspect, was Zadok the Priest, because it's so marvellous. At least I'm still humming it now.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us today, Damian. That's it for this week. Once again, thanks to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring this week's episode. Canaccord will provide you with the expertise you need to help you build your wealth with confidence. Visit candowealth.com for more information.